Expecting Someone Taller by Tom Holt. Chapter 11. At Valhalla, the Wednesday afternoon general meeting of the Aesir, or Company of Gods, is presided over by Wotan himself. At these meetings, the lesser divinities, thunder spirits, river spirits, cloud shepherds, Valkyries, Norns, Nixies, Powers, Thrones, Ettins and Fetches have an opportunity to bring to Wotan's attention any matters which they feel require action on his part, and receive their instructions for the next 7 days. There is also a general discussion on future strategy and long-range weather forecast. Logi, as secretary to the company, had the unenviable task of keeping the minutes of each meeting and presenting the agenda. At the meeting that immediately followed the ring-bearer's entrapment by the Valkyrie Ortlind, he found himself having to reorganise the entire programme to give enough time for a thorough discussion, only to find that the discussion that followed was over much sooner than he had anticipated. There were votes of thanks from the company to Ortlind and Wotan, which were duly entered in the records, and Waltraut inquired how long Ortlind was likely to be away and who was supposed to do her share of the housework while she was absent. Logi was then compelled to proceed to any other business, with well over an hour of the scheduled time still to go. I would like to bring to the chairman's attention the fact that the light bulb on the third-floor landing of the main staircase of Valhalla has gone again, and I would request him to replace it immediately, said Schwertlight, before someone trips over and breaks their neck. That's not nearly as dangerous as the carpet on the back stairs, said Grimgerd. I've asked you hundreds of times to nail it down properly, but nobody ever listens to a word I say. Logi was writing furiously. All the minutes of meetings had to be made in runes, which cannot be written quickly. May I suggest, said Wotan, grimly attempting to make himself heard, that this is neither the time nor the place. Next time you stub your toe in the dark because you couldn't be bothered to replace a light bulb. Wotan put his hands in front of his one eye and groaned audibly. We were discussing the ring, he muttered. And please don't put your elbows on the table, interrupted the Valkyrie Helmleech. I spent the whole morning trying to get it looking respectable after you spilt coffee all over it. Wotan made a vague, snarling noise at the back of his throat. This is a meeting of the Aesir, he growled, and I would ask you to behave in an appropriate manner. While we're on the subject, retorted his daughter, the driver of the spoil, you might try dressing in an appropriate manner. Why you insist on wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row? How am I expected to get the collars clean? Any other business? Wotan said, but his growl was more like a whimper. You've got whole drawers full of shirts you never wear, said Grimgerd, with a world of reproach in the deep pools of her blue eyes. She hadn't had a new shirt or a new anything for 420 years, but she didn't complain. She never went anywhere anyway. I shall wear what the hell I like, when I like, said Wotan, and what had intended to be authority when the words passed his vocal cords was definitely petulance when the sounds emerged through the gate of his teeth. Now can we, please? A general baying of Valkyries drowned out the voice of the sky god, and Logi stopped trying to keep the minutes of the meeting. Over the centuries, he had evolved his own shorthand for the inevitable collapse into chaos that rounded off each Wednesday afternoon in the Great Hall. He sketched in a succession of squiggles under the last intelligible remark he'd been able to record, and began drawing sea serpents. The discussion had moved on to the topic of leaving the tops off jars when a rock troll, who had been thoroughly enjoying the conflicts of his betters, noticed something out of the corner of one of his eyes. He nudged the middle-aged Norn with mouse-blonde hair, who was knitting beside him, and they turned and stared at the doorway of the hall. One by one, the minor deities, then the Vanir, then the high gods themselves, abandoned the debate and gazed in astonishment at the 3 rather pretty girls who had wandered in through the gates of Gylfi. It was at least 1,000 years since the Rhine daughters, who were responsible for the noblest river in Europe, had attended a Wednesday afternoon meeting. No one except Wotan and Logi could remember exactly why they had stopped coming. Some said they had been expelled for flirting with the cloud shepherds at the time of the Great Flood. Others put it down to the girls' natural frivolity and apathy. Wotan and Logi knew that the river spirits had walked out in tears after the stormy debate that followed the theft of the ring from Alberich and had not been back since, although both gods correctly attributed this continued absence to forgetfulness rather than actual principle. "Well, I never," whispered the Norn to the rock troll. "Look who it is." The rock troll nodded his head. Since he had been created out of solid granite at the dawn of time, this manoeuvre required considerable effort on his part, but he felt it was worth it. "It's the girls," he hissed through his adamantine teeth. It was Wotan himself who broke the silence. "What the hell do you want?" he snapped. "We just thought we'd pop our heads round and say hello," said Welgan sweetly. "It's been simply ages." The silence gave way to a hubbub of voices as each immortal greeted the long-lost members of their company. Most vociferous were a group of cloud shepherds who, several centuries before, had arranged to meet the Rhine daughters for a picnic at the place which has since become Manchester, and who had been waiting there ever since. Only the Valkyries and their father seemed less than delighted to see the Rhine daughters back again. Wotan suspected that he knew the reason for their visit, while his daughters felt sure that the river spirits hadn't wiped their feet before coming into the hall. "So," said Wotan, when the noise had subsided, "what have you been doing all these years?" "Sunbathing mostly," said Wagner truthfully. "Doesn't time fly when you're having fun?" "It's all right for some," whispered the Norn to the troll, but the troll seemed uneasy. "Something's going to happen," he said, and he sniffed loudly, as if trying to identify some unfamiliar smell. "Is that all?" laughed Wotan, nervously jovial. "Or have you been doing any work?" "Depends on what you call work," replied Welgund. "The river sort of runs itself, really, but we have been looking at other rivers to see if we can pick up any hints. Sort of an exchange visit," said Wogland helpfully. "For example," continued Welgund, "we visited a river called the Tone in England. Not very helpful, I'm afraid." "But guess who we bumped into while we were over there?" cooed Wogland. "Go on, guess." "I hate guessing," said Wotan irritably, and he picked up a document and began to study it diligently. Since he was to all intents and purposes omnipotent, it was not surprising that he could read a sheet of paper that was palpably the wrong way up. "Ortlind, that's who," said Floshild, who had not spoken before. Wotan made no reply, being obviously engrossed in his document. Suddenly Floshild smiled at the papers in his hand, which turned into a small dragon. Wotan dropped it with a start, and it crawled away under the table. "Now what on earth was she doing there?" The Norn had covered her eyes. She was fond of the Rhine daughters, with whom she had spent many hours exchanging gossip, and Flosshild's conjuring trick, performed in front of so many witnesses, was as clear a case of treasonable assault on the king of the gods as one could hope to find. The penalty for this offence was instant metamorphosis, usually into a bush of some kind, and it was common knowledge that Wotan had been desperate for some pretext for getting rid of the Rhine daughters ever since they had first emerged from the waters of their native river. Slowly the Norn lowered her hands. The girls were still there, still in human shape. "I'll tell you, shall I?" continued Floshild. "She was there trying to get the ring-bearer to give her our ring, which you should have given back to us 1,000 years ago. So will you please tell her to stop it and go away?" The Norn covered her eyes again, but she need not have bothered. Wotan simply looked away and threw a piece of cheese to the small dragon, which had curled up on his lap. "If you don't," said Floshild, clear without being shrill, "we'll tell him who she is. Are you listening?" There was a terrible silence. Never before had anyone, immortal or mortal, dared to threaten the Lord of the Tempest in the hall of his stronghold. Even the rock troll held his breath, and the beating of his basalt heart was the only audible sound in the whole assembly. Wotan sat motionless for a moment, and then rose sharply to his feet, sending the small dragon scampering for the safety of a coffee table. He looked the Rhine daughter in the eye, and the Norn held her breath. Then Wotan shook his head in disbelief and marched out of the hall. "Not across a floor I've spent all morning polishing," wailed the Valkyrie Gerhild, but her father took no notice. The meeting broke up in disorder, and the troll and the Norn hurried off to the mortal's bath for a much-needed drink. "I dunno," said the rock troll. "I've never seen the like." "He just sat there," said the Norn. "Who did?" "Wotan, when Flossie turned that paper into a dragon. It's Kew Gardens for her, I thought, but he just sat there, didn't do a thing." "I didn't mean that," said the rock troll. "I meant the other thing." The Norn wasn't listening. "What I want to know is," she continued, "who is bluffing who? Is it the girls bluffing Wotan, or Wotan bluffing the girls, or are they all at it?" The Troll frowned and scratched his head, producing a sound like 2 millstones. "What are you on about?" he asked. "You are a slow coach, aren't you? If the girls wanted to stop Ortlind from nobbling the ring-bearer, why didn't they just tell him who she was, instead of coming here and making threats to Wotan?" The Troll thought about this for a moment, then nodded his head. He was not so grey as he was granite-looking, and he could see that there was indeed an inconsistency. "What I think," said the Norn excitedly, "is that the ring-bearer already knows who Ortlind is, and he couldn't care less. They've tried telling him, and he doesn't want to know." "How do you make that out?" asked the Troll. "Simple," said the Norn smugly. "They've tried telling him, like I said, and he isn't interested. But they know that Wotan doesn't know that the ring-bearer knows who Ortlind really is. So they threaten to tell the ring-bearer, hoping that the threat will make Wotan tell Ortlind to chuck it and come home." The Troll stared at the bottom of his glass, trying to unravel the Norn's sentence. The Norn took his silence to mean that the Troll was not yet convinced, and elaborated her point. "You see, if Wotan doesn't know that the ring-bearer knows, then he'll be afraid in case the girls tell the ring-bearer, and the girls will try and get him to make some sort of deal. The girls can't make the ring-bearer chuck Ortlind, because the ring-bearer presumably knows already. I mean, he must know, mustn't he? But they can get Wotan to tell Ortlind to chuck it if they can make him think the ring-bearer doesn't know. Do you see what I mean?" "Did you think all that up for yourself?" said the Troll, full of admiration. The Norn blushed. "That's very clever, that is," said the Troll. "But what about the other thing?" "What other thing?" "You know." The Troll made a vague gesture with his huge paw. "The other thing. I smelt it when the girls walked in." It was the Norn's turn to look puzzled. The Troll made a great effort and thought hard. "Why was it," he said at last, "that old Wotan didn't turn the girls into something when they gave him all that lip? You answer me that." "He tried to," said the Norn, "just before he stomped off." "Exactly," said the Troll. "He tried to, but he couldn't. There was something stopping him." "What?" cried the Norn, enthralled. "I dunno, do I? But they brought it in with them. I smelt it. There was something looking after them, or at least it was looking after Miss Flosshill. Didn't you smell it too?" "I'm no good at smells," confessed the Norn, who lived on a bleak, wet fell and had a permanent cold as a result. "Was it some sort of power, do you think?" The Troll had done enough thinking for one day. His mind was made of sandstone, and, besides, he had other things on it. He looked at the Norn for the moment, and for the first time in his life attempted a smile. "You're very clever, you are," he said. "Do you come here often?" The Norn blushed prettily. She noticed that the Troll had very nice eyes, and if one of them happened to be in the middle of his forehead, who cared? The conversation veered away from the ring-bearer and the strange-smelling power, which was ironic in a way, for the change of subject and the emotions that prompted it were largely due to their influence. The Norn had been right up to a point. Malcolm had discovered who the girl he loved really was, but not from the Rhine daughters, or even Alberish, who had rushed back from Germany to tell him. He had heard and finally believed the news only when a sparrow had perched on his shoulder in Bond Street and chirped the information into his ear. By that time, of course, Malcolm was engaged to the girl, which made things all the more difficult. It had only taken 36 hours for Malcolm and the girl who had come to catalogue his library to become engaged to be married. Malcolm was not quite sure why he had felt such an urgent need to get official recognition for this strange and unexpected outbreak of love in Middle Somerset, but it seemed the right thing to do, like getting a contract or a receipt. To his utter astonishment, his proposal had been accepted. The girl had simply looked at her shoes for a moment, smiled at him sadly, and said, "If you're sure." Malcolm had said that he was sure, and the girl had said something along the lines of yes. One is meant to do something wildly demonstrative on such occasions, but Malcolm felt too drained to waste energy in running about or shouting. In fact, he realised he still felt rather depressed, although he didn't imagine why. For her part, the girl was even more taciturn than usual. The pretty scene had taken place beside the river in the grounds of the hall, and they had sat in total silence for a while before getting to their feet and walking back to the house. At the door, the girl turned and looked at him for a moment, then muttered something about getting on with the catalogue. Catalogue? Was she thinking about wedding presents already? What catalogue? Of the library. You don't want to bother with that, surely, I mean— Oh, but I must. The girl looked at him again, not as one would expect a girl to look at her future husband, nor was it an "oh God, what have I gone and done" look. Just a look, that was all. And then she went up to the library. Malcolm sat down on the stairs and put his hands over his ears. He felt confused, and no thoughts would come into his mind. With a tremendous effort, he called up the aspects of the situation that required his immediate attention, and tried to review them in the detail that they seemed to warrant. Unlikely as it seemed, he had just succeeded in getting himself organised for perhaps the first time in his life. He had fallen in love, and for a change, the girl at the other end felt the same way. And instead of letting this chance slip through his fingers, he'd got everything sorted out, and that was all there was to it. There was no earthly reason why he shouldn't get married. He had a house and money, which was what a married man was supposed to need, along with a wife. If there was been anything wrong with the idea, then the girl wouldn't have said yes. She was obviously happy with the arrangement, and it went without saying that it was what he wanted most of all in the whole wide world. Was it? Yes, he concluded, it probably was. Mind you, it did seem a terribly grown-up thing to be doing, but then again, it would be, wouldn't it? So far as he could see, he was happy. He lacked nothing, and had all sorts of nice things to look forward to. Malcolm leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It occurred to him that he had only known this girl for about a day and a half, and that he was being a bit hasty. He dismissed this thought, which was probably cowardice. The trouble was, he reckoned, he was probably afraid of being happy, of having what he really wanted, for some reason or other which he could not be bothered to work out. He got to his feet and walked slowly to the library. The girl was sitting at a table with a pile of books on it, writing something in which looked like a ledger. She did not hear him come in, and he stood looking at her for a moment. Life, he realised, was a fragile thing, and time and opportunity should not be wasted. "Blow that," he said, and the girl started. "Let's go and buy a ring." His words had broken a deep silence, and silence followed them, so that Malcolm had the feeling that he was talking to himself, and this would never do. "Come on," he pleaded. "You don't have to do that now. Everything's going to be all right now." Oddly enough, the girl seemed to understand what he meant by that, which was more than he did himself. She smiled. Why did she always smile and never laugh? And said yes, she would like that. So they went downstairs, and Malcolm walked out to the garage to get the car. Albrecht was sitting on the bonnet eating a ham roll. "This is my lunch, you realise," said the Nibelung. "About the worst thing I could possibly have, barring lobster." "What are you doing here?" Malcolm asked. "I came straight back from Germany," continued Albrecht. "I saw the two of you together just now, and I knew in a minute what had happened." "Thank you." "You know who she is, don't you?" Malcolm stared at him. "Of course I do," he said. "Do you?" "Well, of course." Malcolm frowned. How in God's name did Albrecht know who she was? Did he have a library too? Malcolm suddenly felt that he didn't want to know. "I know all about her," he said, "and we've just got engaged. We're going to London to buy a ring." "Buy a ring?" said Albrecht, genuinely surprised. "I'd have thought that was unnecessary." Malcolm did not understand this remark, so he assumed it must be a joke. Perhaps, in the back of his mind, he had an idea that Albrecht was trying to tell him something very important, but if that was the case, he managed to ignore it. He squeaked a polite laugh out of his lungs and unlocked the car. "Hang on, though," said Albrecht. "Sorry, I haven't got time," said Malcolm. "I think we should get it in Bond Street. That's where all the jewellers' shops are, aren't they?" "Why not in Amsterdam or Johannesburg?" asked Albrecht quietly. "She wouldn't understand about the Tarnhelm," Malcolm said. "It might frighten her." "Most unlikely. Are you sure you know?" Malcolm started the engine and pressed the accelerator hard. Perhaps Albrecht was saying something tremendously important. If he was, he couldn't hear a word of it. The Prince of the Nibelungs hopped off the bonnet and banged on the window. Malcolm wound it down and shouted, "I'll see you when we get back. The housekeeper will make you a cup of tea, I expect." Then he let in the clutch and drove furiously out of the garage. Alberic stood for a moment and scratched his head. Then it occurred to him that he'd been wasting his time. He picked up a spanner which was lying on the floor of the garage and hurled it at the wall. Malcolm deliberately parked on a double yellow line in the middle of Bond Street. It was that sort of a day. If a traffic warden came and wrought him a ticket, he could tell her that he was engaged to be married to the most wonderful girl in the world. He wanted to tell people that, if only to hear himself say it. Anyway, he was feeling much better now, if a trifle hysterical. The girl seemed to have cheered up too. Almost for the first time since he'd known her, she had laughed properly, and that was a wonderful sound to be anywhere near. In fact, Malcolm was at a loss to know what had got into her, for she behaved very childishly in all of the jewellers' shops they went into. She insisted on trying on all the rings they saw, taking them to the window to see what they looked like in the light, and then saying that they wouldn't do. The stones were the wrong colour, or too small or too big, or the settings were the wrong shape. It almost seemed as if she wasn't taking this business seriously. They had tried 6 shops, and it was nearly 5:30. "Oh, it's no good," said the girl. "I don't like any of the ones we've seen, and I'm the one who's going to be wearing it forever and ever," she added tenderly. For some reason, this remark struck Malcolm as being rather out of character, but he put it down to excitement. "We can try that one over there if we're quick," he suggested. "No," said the girl. "I know the ring I want," and she told him. As she did so, it began to rain. The 2 sparrows that had been eating crumbs outside the largest of the jewellers' shops looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" said the first sparrow. "Don't speak with your beak full," said the other. "But, Mum," replied the first sparrow, "it's him, and he's going to give her the big ring." "It's none of our business, and you'll catch your death if you don't get under cover this instant." "But, Mum," insisted the first sparrow, "if he gives her the big ring, it would be terrible, wouldn't it?" "How many times must I tell you not to listen to what other people are saying? It's rude." The second sparrow flapped her wings nervously. It was indeed terrible, and she did not want to get involved. "But do you think he knows how terrible it would be? Do you?" "Quiet, people are staring." "It's rude to stare," replied the first sparrow, who had been told this many times. "But if he doesn't know, shouldn't we tell him? Because if we don't—" 2 ravens had appeared in the sky, wheeling slowly and noiselessly above the street. Nobody noticed them. They had come to see, not to be seen. "It isn't him at all," said the second sparrow nervously. "It's just your imagination. If you don't come in this minute, I'll tell your father." Malcolm was standing very still. The girl was smiling at him, saying nothing. He wanted to give her the ring. He could see no reason why he should not. Almost from the first moment he had met her, he had wanted to give her the ring, and now he was going to do it. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. The young sparrow hopped morosely under a parked van. His mother was scolding him, but he wasn't listening. Surely it couldn't be right that the ring-bearer should give the ring to Wotan's daughter. His mother stopped chirping at him for a moment and stooped down to peck at his bottle top. Now was his chance. "Please," said the girl, "I'd like it very much." Malcolm took the ring between the first and third fingers of his left hand and started to pull it off. He was afraid that it might not come away easily, but it slid off effortlessly, and he held it for a moment. The girl was still smiling, not holding out her hand, not making a movement of any sort. He tried to read her thoughts, but he could not. He could feel the rain running through his hair, but he did not know what it was. It was right that the girl should have the ring. It would be very easy to give it to her. Nothing at all could be easier, and then they would be properly engaged. The sparrow forced itself through the air like a bullet and landed awkwardly on Malcolm's shoulder. He did not seem to notice. He had other things on his mind. "Don't do it!" shrieked the bird. "She's Wotan's daughter!" For a moment Malcolm did not know where the voice was coming from. Then he felt feathers brushing the side of his face, which made him jump. As he started, he dropped the ring, which rolled into the gutter. "She's Wotan's daughter! She's Wotan's daughter! She's his daughter!" screamed the sparrow. Malcolm swung his left arm furiously through the air and clapped the palm of it onto his right shoulder. He felt something fragile snapping under the fingers, and the voice stopped suddenly. The dead bird rolled down his arm and fell onto the pavement. It looked like a child's toy or a hockey puck, and it had landed in a puddle. Then the girls stooped down to pick up the ring. Without knowing what he was doing, Malcolm covered it with his foot. It was all he was able to do, but apparently it was enough. The girl stepped backwards and she had a look on her face that Malcolm did not like very much. "I really do love you," she said. Without even wanting to, Malcolm found himself reading her thought. "I love you too," he said, and he bent down and picked up the ring. "If I offered this to you, would you take it?" "Yes," said the girl. "And you'd give it to your father?" "Yes." Malcolm closed his fist around the ring. "It's raining," he said. "You'll catch cold." The girl looked at her shoes and said nothing. He slowly put the ring back on his finger. He wanted her to have it more than ever, but it felt terribly tight now, and he doubted whether he'd be able to get it off again without soap and water. There was some quotation about there being a providence in the fall of a sparrow, but he'd never really understood what it meant. He opened the car door for her. "Are we still engaged then?" he asked. "I don't know," she said. "Are we? I mean, is there any point? But we love each other, don't we?" "Yes, we do," he added, for he knew how indecisive she could be at times. "And there's all the point in the world." "Everything I told you about my family is true," she said, fastening her seatbelt. "So I don't think there is any point really, is there?" Malcolm could not quite follow that one, but he wasn't bothered about it. He could read her thoughts. This was all so silly. When they were on the motorway, Malcolm broke the silence that had lasted since they'd left London. "Obviously you know who I am," he said. "So you know I can read thoughts. I can read exactly what you're really thinking." The girl said nothing. "Which is probably just as well," said Malcolm irritably, "since you never say anything. But I can see what you're thinking, so it's no use pretending. For crying out loud, you love me more than I love you." "That's for you to say." "Then be quiet and listen. You don't have to give him the ring." "You don't have to keep it." Malcolm wanted to grab hold of her and shake her, but he was being overtaken by a lorry and needed both hands for the wheel. "Don't you understand anything?" he shouted. The girl stared at the floor and said nothing. "If I was feeling as bloody miserable as you are, I'd burst into tears," he said savagely. "But you won't let yourself do that, will you?" He pulled over onto the hard shoulder and stopped the car. 2 ravens were circling overhead. Malcolm said a lot of things, some of them very loudly, some of them very quietly, and after a while he started to cry. But the girl said nothing, and there was no point in saying any more. "All right then," he whispered. "You can have it, but not yet. Not yet." "I dunno," said Thought, as he watched the car draw up at Coombe Hall. "Humans." The doors opened, and Malcolm and the Valkyrie Ortlind climbed out. "Now what?" whispered Memory. Malcolm put his arm round the Valkyrie, and she rested her head against his face. The sharp eyes of the ravens could easily pick out the ring, glittering on his finger. Neither the mortal nor the Valkyrie said a word as they went into the house. But the air was full of thoughts, and the ravens felt very frustrated that they could only read Ortlind's half of them. The door of the house closed, and the 2 ravens sat thoughtfully for a while, listening to the wind sighing in the pine trees that surrounded the hall. They had seen many things in their time. They had seen Albrecht screaming with rage and pain when Logi tore the ring from his chained hands. They had seen Hagen drive his spear between Siegfried's shoulders, and Hagen himself struggling for the last time in the floodwaters of the Rhine. Nothing surprised them any more. "Thick as 2 short planks, both of them," said Memory, at last.